Welcome everyone to the final webinar in this Community Engagement and Research Uptake series. This event is brought to you by the Global Health Network and its knowledge hubs, which are ARCH, stands for Applying Research to Policy and Practice for Health, and MESH, the Community Engagement Network. My name is Erica Nelson. I'm a research fellow within the Health and Nutrition Cluster at the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, UK. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Ntokozo Yingwana and Suchi Gaur and the Global Health Network team. ARCH and MESH have been working in partnership to present this webinar series to hear directly from those at the cutting edge of community engagement work as applied to policy influencing and research agenda shaping. Recordings from the previous 4 webinars in this series, quite a lot of material covered, explored maternal and child health, mental health, antimicrobial resistance, are all available on the link, which someone from the Global Health Network team, probably Helen, will post in the chat. Where the organization where I work, where I'm actually physically sat at the moment, is in Brighton, England, sort of in the south coast. If none of you have been here before, it's lovely. Come visit Brighton by the Sea. I work at the Institute of Development Studies, which is a leader in the field of participatory research approaches and power-aware approaches to community engagement and involvement. And it's through work that I did for the National Institute for Health and Care Research to develop their own sort of learning and resources on CEI that I came to know Helen and the work of MESH, which is kind of what brought me here today. But more importantly than why I'm here is that we're going to be hearing from Suchi and Ntokozo, who both work differently positioned, as they will explain, but they work at the intersection of social movements, activist networks, and research that is recasting understandings of gender, sexuality, and health inequities. And these are issues that are personally very close to my heart. I've done a lot of past work with sexual reproductive health rights activists in a Latin American context. This might be a bit too early for groups from Latin America to have joined us today, depending where they are in the world. But yeah, that's another important space where these ideas have developed. I'm delighted to introduce, to begin with, Ntokozo Yingwana, who is a researcher and PhD candidate with the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand, or the WITS, in South Africa. And her doctoral work is titled Queering Sex Work and Mobility in Southern Africa. How does migration, mobility, movement influence gendered sexualities and sex work? Sorry, it's a bit of a tongue twister. Ntokozo also serves as the Communication and Research Uptake Officer for the Migration and Health Project Southern Africa. She's going to talk about that. She's a passionate champion of gender, sexuality, and sex worker rights, scholar activism in an African context, and she's worked previously with the Sex Worker Education and Advocacy Task Force, the African Sex Worker Alliance, and the Global Network of Sex Work Projects. So that is enough from me. Let's turn it over to Ntokozo and let her share with us her work. Thank you, Ntokozo. Over to you.
Thank you, Erica, for the introduction. And thank you, Mesh and Arch, for inviting me to be part of this webinar. And I really appreciate being in this kind of space because it allows us to not only just share each other's work, but to also learn from each other and from different contexts that we come from. So my name, as mentioned, is Ntokozo Yingwana. I'm a researcher and PhD candidate with the African Center for Migration and Society. ACMS is a research center that's based at WITS, and we not only focus on conducting research that relates to migration and mobility, but we also look at creative ways in which we can conduct research around migration mobility. And we also, our work also intersects with issues pertaining to health, issues pertaining to gender and sexuality rights. And so we find that because of the nature of the kind of work that we do, we find ourselves coming across communities that are marginalized, and we have to find creative ways in which to engage those communities in our research processes, which are not necessarily your traditional ways of conducting research. And so I'm going to be speaking today a bit about project that I'm involved in at ACMS, which is called the Migration and Health Project Southern Africa. So MAP basically, it's a team of ACMS students, postdocs and researchers, and also associates, so persons that might have worked with ACMS before or engaged with us in projects, who are also researchers, and also civil society that comes together around issues pertaining to migration and health within the SADC region. And so we find ourselves in a situation where we are having to work with different stakeholders and different audiences. So we had to find creative ways in which we engage with those different audiences and stakeholders. And that's why we created the MAP website. So much of today, I'm going to be chatting about the MAP website, which I helped to develop when I joined ACMS in 2016 and have since continued to manage. And with the help of the MAP research team, I helped produce the content which populates the site. Okay, so just briefly, time allowing, I'll chat a bit about some of the public engagement initiatives that we've engaged in, and some of the multimedia content that we produced from the research that we've produced, and how we've also played around with arts-based methods and how we've distributed those in the form of e-newsletters and social media. Okay, so the SADC region is associated with high rates of population and mobility. But what tends to also happen is that we tend to forget the role of health as one of the central determinants when it comes to our understanding of migration or mobility, not just in the region, but generally as well. And this tends to be the result of a lack of evidence-based, this tends to result in a lack of evidence-based responses to the predicaments that we find, or the kind of social ills that we find, or the health situations that we find ourselves in. And so, sorry, I'm just gonna move this. And so we've had to also acknowledge for ourselves that the process that we're engaging in terms of the knowledge that we're producing and the ways in which we're producing it, is in itself a political process. And for us as researchers at MAP, we are pretty much okay with that, because many of us do self-identify as scholar activists in our work. So we do actually want the work that we produce to help the civil society in terms of engaging policymakers or advocating for rights, but also changing society's mindset. So I'll chat a bit about that later. Oops, sorry. Okay, I think that's it. So like I mentioned, we've got the MAP website, and actually a part of me was kind of wondering if I shouldn't, maybe at some point I will switch and move us onto the site. It might be a bit easier for us to toggle through using the website really. So the site is generally helping us to, like I mentioned earlier, to generate and commit knowledge in order to improve our responses to migration, health, and well-being in the region. And we, sorry, I am trying to move things around. And it is coordinated and managed by the director of ACMS now, Professor Joe Beery. Some of you might be familiar with their work. That's him there in the corner there. Oops. Okay. And some of this stuff, so I'm just going to go through some of the main areas, and I think I'll rather switch on to going through the website itself. The slides and the screenshots really don't do it much justice, and it's a bit of a tricky one trying to move things around so I can actually see the slides. And some of the things that we do as well in terms of our public engagement is to organize symposiums and webinars like these ones, but also we have art exhibitions. So there's a project that I'm going to speak a bit later on called MOVE. It's methods, move methods and visuals, methods, visual, move. And it actually engages participants, and much of its research has been with migrant sex workers, and it uses arts-based methods such as zines. And let me just maybe move to that slide quickly. It makes use of zines and quills to try and engage participants in those processes, research processes, but also uses those artifacts as advocacy pieces, whereby when we're exhibiting, we invite not only just the public, but also policymakers and other stakeholders that we're wanting to engage on the issues. So it's method, visual, explore, sorry. I'm gonna perhaps go a bit back. And we also, before COVID, now we might also revive that. What we'd also do is to host film screenings, where perhaps if there's a film that has something to do with migration and mobility, we would screen it and then invite the producers or the directors to come and chat to us about it along with the audience. And it would be more than just like dissecting the film from an aesthetics point of view, but also engaging in the issues involved. Okay. And then here, this is possibly where I'm going to shift to the site itself. Some of the multimedia outputs that we produce are podcasts and videos. And some of these you'll see that actually they interviews either on radio or TV. But what we've also done is ourselves is to have some of the researchers try to translate or convert some of their research into accessible outputs such as blogs and podcasts. So we've also got podcasts where one of the researchers is reciting a poem that is encapsulating some of the research that they're engaging with. So we try to work with the researcher to try and find an outlet that is not only accessible to the public, but also allows them to convey their research in a more a meaningful way as well. Okay, and I've already spoken about Move. Oh, and yes, so one of the things that we also do is to produce what we call project books, I suppose. And the project books allow us to encapsulate what was done in the process of the research, what was accomplished, but also it allows us to reflect on the process itself and where we can improve, and it allows the participants themselves to also be able to give their own reflections. So yes, so if you go to www.map, which is MAHPSA, mapsa.org, you will find us there. And so as I was chatting a bit about some of the outputs, so it's some of the public engagements, I'll open those in a tab. And apart from the publications, the usual books, chapters and whatnot, policy briefs, we also have ebooks, which I want to click through a bit. And then the media. So in media, we've got some the usual op-eds, but also podcasts and some videos. Okay, let me see if I can get those two open. Right. Okay. So like, as I think it's much better for me to just chat through this. As I was saying with the public engagement, so it ranges from symposiums to dialogues and whatnot. And what we try to do is to publicize that on the website before and share it also on our social media, but then afterwards do a little like report or something and share it also on the site as well. So here I was chatting about the exhibitions. So here is some of the Move exhibitions. So they make use of zines and posters in their research process. And actually this one is also making use of a newsletter. So the project got the participants to produce a newsletter, and the newsletter actually served as data, but also it also served as an artifact that can help in terms of advocacy. What I also wanted to show in terms of the ebooks, so the ebooks are quite nice because you get across between the digital and the actual feel of paging. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ebooks. We use ISU. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but the nice thing is that it allows you to kind of like, if it will allow me, I think I might have too many things moving around. Let's see. So it allows you to embed an electronic copy of the, okay, it's not allowing me to click the pages through, but there It is moving. It allows you to embed an electronic copy of whatever the publication is, and then people can engage with it as if it is like a spread. I'm supposed to be clicking on the edges and it's supposed to be flipping like a page nicely, but it's not behaving right now. And then, like I said, with the podcast, we do have interviews and whatnot in there as well. Some of our researchers, when they're being interviewed, we also include their podcasts there. And what we find is that it makes the research more accessible. Oh, and I probably should have mentioned this also early on. We do make use of other social media platforms, where like YouTube, for instance, to embed the videos, but then we share it on the website, and ISU to embed the ebooks, but we share it on the website. And then for the podcasts, we make use of SoundCloud, and then we share it on the website.
This is the Power 98.7 podcast.
Okay, so that's still working. I'm just clicking through now to give you a sense of what's there, but please feel free to check it out. I mean, we've got, like I said, some of the videos are based on projects. So this was by one of our art fellows, Madoda Mkobeni. And, oh, sorry, that's not the click through. And like I mentioned earlier, we embed on YouTube. We upload on YouTube and then embed.
Like, how did you get in? Doing your photo. When I come back bringing those photos, I would relax, sit around the fire, or bask in the sun with them, watch them doing whatever they're doing. I wasn't shutter happy, taking pictures.
Okay, so here we have one of our interns at the time, Esther, interviewing the art fellow, and they're talking through the research process. So it's also really about demystifying research in itself, and not only making it accessible to policymakers who are important in terms of decision making, but also the public. And I think I've run out of time now, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you. If you have any questions, please let them come through.
Thank you, Ntokozo. That was really a visual feast. So thank you. Now I'm going to go myself and look at a number of those things you just shared. There's rich material there for people to explore. We're going to move on to our next speaker, but I just want to pause here for a second and say that if you have questions for what Ntokozo just talked about, the presentation she gave, what we're going to do is consolidate all the Q&A questions sort of once both speakers have presented, and then we'll roll into the Q&A. So please do feel free to start to use that Q&A box to post your questions, and your reflections, having just heard that great presentation. Thank you. I'm going to move on now, and I have a great pleasure in introducing Suchi Gaur, who is the Director of Global Engagement and Impact at World YWCA based in Switzerland. Dr. Gaur has over 12 years experience working at the confluence of gender, public health, and communication, technology in the NGO, nonprofit, startup, parliamentary, and research sectors. She is originally from India, and she joined World YWCA in 2018, where she is combining her expertise in behavior change, social marketing, and community mobilization into prioritizing the engagement and mobilization of women and young women around the world. And she's an active volunteer in a number of organizations, including WHOERG, World Pulse, and the Strategic Advisory Group for WHO Foundation. Suchi, over to you. And again, a reminder to everyone that you can post your questions into the Q&A that we will then pick up once Suchi is presented. Thank you.
So that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And lots of great insights and interconnectedness to some of the things that I'll be talking about. First of all, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak to such a wonderful audience. What I'm going to do today is share some examples, some stories, some learnings that we've been having as we have tried to look at how do we decolonize research? How do we make research more accessible to the people that we are doing it for? How do we look at sexual and gender rights work from a lens of not leaving the people behind? And so I've been working in this area of sexual and gender rights for a long time. And it's not very far away from being a feminist. It's not very far away from practicing feminism every day, because the principles we are talking about when we talk about sexual and gender rights are about equality and equity, are about diversity and inclusion, and are about participation and human rights-based approaches. So when I look at sexual and gender rights work, it is very intricately linked to how I work within a global movement, which is 160 years old, global women's rights movement, which has been fighting for a number of issues, including SGBV, reproductive rights, peace and justice. While we look at this, when it comes to data collection, data analysis, data and understanding evidence, it is very strange that we are still using the same old mechanisms and tools of interviews, surveys, FGDs. Or maybe if we are using them, we are still using them in the ways that they were designed. They were designed by people, and generally men, who looked at people from a lens of these are participants or subjects, passive subjects. So while we have progressed in the way a lot of how the world of engagement, the world of policy generation should look at, we are still not there when it comes to looking at research from a decolonized approach, a truly decolonized approach. We're not considering how research must consider the soft nuances of engaging with the audience that it impacts the most. Today, what I'm trying to do is share my experience of how, as a part of a global movement, a movement which is 160 years old, we've been working at and trying to attempt at something which is trying to decolonize research. So before we go to the next thought, I wanted to start with a story. And this is a story of, I think, many years back when I was actually in a small village in India doing research on sexual and reproductive rights. And I was young, very aware of the realities of the communities that I was interacting with, very prepared to go into the field, do my work as a researcher. But the moment I entered one of the villages and I met a woman, the first thing she said to me was, don't ask, and in her local language was, don't ask me about what contraceptive method I'm using. And that struck by me, because the first thing she said that was, I'm not going to tell you, or don't ask me this. And when I dug deeper and I started engaging with the community players and I started asking about it, that's when I got to know that many people prior to me had come in, looking at them as passive subjects, taking up the data and leaving behind, without any information of why the data was being collected, or how that will be impacting their lives, how that information will be impacting their lives, without also understanding the harm that it might be causing to them when they went back into their homes. So looking at these layers, what very often I understood was at that period, and then over the years, what we have understood is that the research in its very basic sense very often doesn't look at the power structures within the community, within the power structures and the play of power within the researcher and the participant in that research. We are not thinking about how the timelines, we think more about the timelines in form of how we have to do the research, but not in very thoughtful about how our research, especially based on the critical issues that we are addressing through it, might need an extended timeline or a flexible timeline or a timeline that includes the perspective of including community or engaging community during the process and not just before and after. There's a lot of understanding that we've had in the past few years around, and I've had over the past many years of my research work around stories and how story collection is critical to closing of loops, and how all of us are making that mistake. So while I'm sharing that one incident where I went into that community and I heard this thing and I realized the impact that other people and their researchers were having on my research, and my research must be having on other people's research work and the community itself, I realized that I might not be the only one feeling this. So here I am inviting you all to start thinking about what are the mistakes that you've made in the field when you have done research, or what are the mistakes that we have as researchers made that have impacted the community or impacted other researchers as well. Let me step back and tell a little bit about myself. I'm a storyteller, a listener. I love evidence, and evidence-based approaches is all I do throughout the work that I do with working with women and young women from around 100 countries in this world right now. I think as a researcher, what has been the biggest strength for me has been the lens of empathy and understanding inclusion and diversity in everyday work that I do. Working at the intersection, as my description said, of gender, public health, and technology, I have understood deeply about how these things interplay with power, and how that has impacted the work that we've been trying to do as researchers, as evidence gatherers, as policymakers, as community activists all around the world. A lot of the work that I do is based on a holistic approach to everything, looking at it on how to close the loop, focusing extensively on how to close the loop. So when I work in World YWCA, which is a global women's rights movement, there is a lot of emphasis we try to bring in around research and engagement and impact of community through strategic partnerships and collaborations, working with usual and unusual partners, not some people that might generally be considered as researchers. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. Praxis, PRA, most significant change. These have been traditional ways. They have broken the traditional ways of doing things. And while at some point in history, photographs and stories were not considered as a great evidence point, today somebody has worked hard to showcase that they are indeed tools through which we can collect great data, especially when we are working on sensitive issues like gender and sexual rights. So where are we going wrong? Where are we doing wrong? What are we doing wrong? I won't get into the dynamics of decolonizing research a lot, but because that can take lectures. But a broader narrative around decolonizing research talks about respect, responsibility, and humility. And during my research years as a feminist activist and researcher working on these issues, I completely think at many places this seems to be missing link. Some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves is, who is benefiting through this research? Who is defining the agenda, and what is the agenda of this research? Whom are we working for as researchers? Whom are we working for? Who is the us and other in the work that we are trying to do? Who is the other? Who is the one who is describing the how part of how this research will be conducted? And how everything in this is very strong perspective and is extremely interconnected. So for me, for example, if I go back to the example where 2 slides back, which I shared, there are days I wonder, my brain wonders, a great perspective of people who went to those community young women, asking them about their contraceptive methods and their choice on family planning, would have been first working with them to define the agenda, to make them understand who is it benefiting them. How are we the other people who are coming in rather than being the other people? How are we working towards that goal with them, not for them? And how they must be engaged in defining the how part of it, not just come in as gap fillers, as passive participants, as people who are just being used as subjects. So in the way the research scenarios work, while we are trying to question around ethics, yes, do no harm, and we get all paperwork signed, actually many a times the loop is not closed, and we do not get that information if after we have moved from the community, after we have moved from the the community that we are working with, has the research made any harm to them? Do they understand how our research is benefiting their rights, their sexual and gender rights? Are they part of those discussions around policy advocacy? Are they the ones telling the story, or are we sharing their evidence on their behalf? Did we take permission that we will be sharing this evidence on their behalf? There are so many questions here which go beyond signing consent forms or ethical spaces. So, and this is important because we're talking about applying a feminist lens to research to get gender disaggregated data and analysis for community engagement within research and evidence generation. So a typical research process is which helps monitor and evaluate gender inequalities, but they have been very gender biased. A typical research processes, even though it will help you understand gender inequalities, is still gender biased because it is designed by men who have generally designed it, or people who have generally designed it without taking feedback from the people who it is impacting. So what I emphasize right now in the work that we are trying to do is redistributing power within the process of data collection, evidence generation, research, agenda defining, and bringing that on table to the policymakers to actually make policies that matter to the people and that people are aligned with and understand with it. And this is very complicated. So thank you. Thanks. We talk about 3-4 main things, one of which is participation, which fosters on how it is important for us to bring all voices, especially those that have been historically excluded. How do we talk about open dialogue, include them at every step of decision making, create a group of heterogeneous people that it's the research is impacting. And then there is the whole idea of inclusion, because we are talking about understanding systems from a lens of power and oppression. We are talking about, a great example is sexual and reproductive rights here, where if we are trying to change narratives, the narratives should need to be defined by the young women or the women or the people whom we are working with. And then there is language, and the work we do, we emphasize a lot on the use of language and democratizing access and promoting inclusion through language, and language not from a sense of which language they use, but from a sense of how are we speaking what we are sharing, how are we writing the research objectives, how are we, what are the terminologies we are using, how accessible is language to them, how they are part of that process, and yet they understand every process, because language is used as a tool which empowers them rather than victimizes them. So according to us at World YWCA, we have just recently developed a feminist consultation methodology after 3 years of working with women and young women from around the world, where they have worked to define what is a way through which young women and women can be consulted in a more feminist manner to generate data that is feminist, to look at stories and see it as a tool to gather enough evidence to come to a point where we can ask for policy changes that they want for. So I'm going to close with one story, and that's a very critical story because it talks about COVID and the impact that COVID has had on the sexual and gender rights of a lot of people. So early in 2020, when COVID struck, we realized a lot of the YWCAs around the world immediately were doing a lot of work on ground, working on sexual and gender-based violence that grew drastically, we all know, during this, that impacted livelihood and employment and all the other issues that women and young women were facing. And based on that work, we gathered enough evidence to create a first policy frame of, according to us, the role of young people and young women particularly is very, very critical in combating COVID. And we were trying to shift the narrative from young people being the COVID spreaders to young people being actually the problem solvers, because we had enough evidence. And we worked together with 6 big youth organizations around the world to work with WHO and UN Foundation to fund young people directly through us. So we gathered a lot of evidence to do this work, and then we got funded under COVID Solidarity Grant to implement program with young people where the decision making of how the money will be used for COVID recovery will be in the hands of young people. So there was microfunding approach. There were many layers to it. And now after 1.5 years of implementing that project, we again have enough evidence to showcase how engagement of community, of the people whom COVID impacted the most, has been instrumental in bringing up enough evidence to say why we need to again invest in young people. So we have a case of 2 years and 3 years, 2.5, 3 years of enough support and evidence gathering that is helping us understand and push for engagement as a key driver of youth and sexual and gender rights and policy changes around those. So that's just one of the stories, but we have a number of that, and there's a lot of work, and somewhere down the line, we are launching the feminist consultation methodology that will be live very soon, and we'll be more than happy to share it with the research community here. So I'm happy to answer more questions, but thanks. Over to you, Erica.
But one of the questions about it comes from it's making a point about that community is often, and this is in the context of doing work in Malawi, you engage them at the beginning of the process rather than the middle or the end. This is sort of the common practice in what has long been community engagement in health work and health research. And it says that if they're not engaged in the process, or if they become engaged later, it's often because the research isn't going as to plan, because unexpected things come up, and so like less numbers recruited or used as a recruitment tool. So this sort of just reflecting on this challenge of how do you make community engagement through the life cycle of a project. Maybe what are some of the challenges or enabling factors you yourselves have witnessed in terms of embedding it and integrating it in a more meaningful way? And related to that is, well, then what do you do as well if you're trying to encourage engagement at the start and there isn't a burning issue that people want resolved? So similarly, if you're sort of experiencing apathy or sort of challenges to engagement because there's not an obvious link between the research that's being done and the perceived needs of local community members. So why don't we start with you, Ntokozo, since Suchi just spoke, and then we'll turn to Suchi, some initial reflections on this question about sort of process.
Okay, thank you so much for that question, because it allows me to speak a bit more about my own personal work. So the work I presented earlier was more of like my organizational work. And in terms of my research, I actually use the feminist participatory action research methodology a lot. And for my doctoral study right now, I obviously also use it. And it was mentioned earlier on, but for people's purpose, I'll repeat it. My title is Queering Sex Work and Mobility in Southern Africa. And the question really is, how does migration, movement, or mobility influence gendered sexualities in sex work? And for me, even though the idea, or like the seed for the idea, had been planted during my time of working at SWET, which is the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force, and anecdotes from comrades about their experiences in the industry. But it was actually when I was able to work with sex workers who are migrants as co-researchers on the project that I felt that I was actually engaging, or rather facilitating engaged research. And for me, so there's also, it's quite interesting really. So I ended up hiring a Zimbabwean migrant sex worker and a South African mobile, as in they move in the different towns within the country, mobile sex worker as co-researchers. And for me, it was very important because I wanted to push the envelope that we as feminist scholars, we're always saying, oh yeah, we engage in community, we engage in community. But I tend to sense that it's more tokenistic. It's like, oh, I'll give you a camera, you take some photos and I've engaged you. But like, why don't we try to actually engage the communities that we work with as intellectual partners? And that's what I wanted to do in this work. And so I would work with the research assistants. We would like every week, we had the WhatsApp research group that we'd set up as one of the stages in the fieldwork. And every week we had to come up with a research question or task for the participants in the group. And I would engage with them and I would share with them the research materials that I had, like the literature, so that we would chat about it, you know. And when it came to also analyzing the data, they helped with the translations and the transcribing, but also analyzing, which is very important because they bring embodied knowledge and insights that I don't have. And to the point where I had no intention of writing this paper, but I got reeled in when the two RAs submitted an abstract to the Global Public Health Journal to write a journal article, a reflection piece on their role as co-researchers on this research project. And when the abstract got accepted, they reeled me in as a third author. And we're busy with that now. And it's a bit unfortunate. It's a bit of a sore point to actually talk about it because one of the RAs recently passed away. So myself and the other RA are having to finish a paper without them there. But it's important that we recognize that we have to engage our communities at intellectual levels as well. We need to see people as experts of their own lives and not just go in with this idea of harvesting people for data. And for me, it was beautiful when it was them who actually were like, no, we want to write this paper. You come help us, because at the end of the day, we really do want them to take the lead in the knowledge production process. So in terms of encouraging engagement, I think it's important to embed yourself in the community, get a sense of some of the issues that they're grappling with, but also ask the people you want to work with, what are the issues that are important to them, and work with them in terms of figuring out a way in which to engage in those issues in the research process. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Suchi, do you want to add to that, or do you want me to put in another question?
No, I just want to add, I mean, this is a lot about privilege as researchers that we carry, and understanding that what are our roles and how do we let go of certain roles to open up the arms and see community as expert rather than seeing them as participants. And I think it was a great example, that was just shared. And for me, personally, as a person who's working on feminist rights movement, we call everyone who's everyone can be an expert. Everyone can know more. We just cannot see people as gap fillers or subjects, or we will bring them in on certain steps only. And it is moral obligation of researchers that as feminists, as a feminist activist, we question at every step, even what we do. So I feel it's a great story that was shared, and I really can resonate to it at so many levels, because we've been through that process, and it can be very empowering to them to actually see, because very often we hear from the community, and this is the second question which was raised, like how in the start, when they don't feel there is a need, because many times the needs are very different. They see the need of food as the most immediate need than sexual and gender rights. So that conversation, those discussions, those working with the community to actually have them come up with that answer is what we have tried to do with our feminist consultation methodology, where we are saying people define their agendas. So yeah, just wanted to add that bit.
I'm gonna just because this other question sort of about encouraging involvement was picked up in terms of that, both of your answers, and move to a question that Haiti Bell's asking about. Well, you've both now talked about sort of power dynamics within communities, between communities, who is the community, but her question is sort of how communities used as this broad label, right, in quotes, and how can researchers best equip themselves to understand to have this deeper contextual understanding of power dynamics within the spaces where they're working, between the spaces that they're working, and the likely effects of those power dynamics on participatory research. So I'll turn back to Ntokozo if you want to pick up on that first, and then Suchi, or both, or either, but this, power in practice, I suppose, and the sort of problematic use of the term community that can often cover over internal heterogeneity within a community. Would either of you like to pick that up? Ntokozo, you want to go first?
Okay, I will try. When you're speaking about the different power dynamics, first there was the power dynamic between myself being the student researcher and my co-researchers or research assistants. And but then there was also the power dynamic. So we were trying to destabilize that with FPAR. But then there was also a power dynamic that I wasn't aware of, but that was raised by one of the research assistants in the process in one of our meetings, about how they now saw themselves in relation to the other participants in the group. And they are also part of the participants group, and they're also part of the broader community that they're identifying as migrant mobile sex workers as well. So it's very difficult, I'll say, as like an inside outsider, we like calling ourselves that, to gauge the level of like the type of power dynamics that are at play and how the research process can affect those dynamics. So it's very important to, I know it's going to sound a bit like hammered on now, to do take your lead from the people that you're working with, the community that will, or more specifically, and which is why it was very helpful for me to have co-researchers who are also part of the participant group, because they were able to give me insights that I would never have. So when I was made aware of that, I'm like, oh, actually me conducting research in this way is actually affecting this community in this way, also forced me to kind of like take a step back and reevaluate my role in all of this. And in the end, what it forced me to do is to actually have to take up actually more of the power than I wanted, because for them to not be seen as like, oh, Miss Goody Two Shoes, you know, teacher's pet kind of thing, I had to show to the rest of the group, okay, no, actually, they're not just like trying to like outshine you, but I'm the one who's still like overall seeing the project. I'm the one still responsible for the decision. So if you're unhappy about anything, it is me who's like at fault or whatnot. So kind of like playing the field a bit and feeling your way around. Yeah, it's very difficult to have a straight out answer, but that's how I try to navigate that.
No, that's a really accurate reflection, I think, of how live these dynamics are, and how much you have to navigate them in a really kind of lived way that is difficult to even express after the fact. So thanks for capturing that, though. I'm actually good, Suchi, instead of you answering that question, because we only have like 2 minutes left before we sort of turn to the final wrap up, I want to pick up on another question. It's from Patrick Siko, Fairly in Liberia, and he's asking a question about when you have to restrict research activities because it goes against local participants' cultural values or norms, yet research sponsors who are financially like determining how activities would go. So I guess that tension between, the people who are putting the money on the table for the thing to happen, the realities of doing that work in a like engaged way, but also in an ethical way, and how you navigate that tension if you're perhaps stuck in the middle of it. So I don't know if you got that question or you want me to read it more in full, but my understanding of what Patrick's getting at is that you have a financial sort of interest determining what activities are supposed to be taking place, and then possibly what you encounter is something that is very counter to the assumptions or expectations of how a project is designed to run. And then a researcher who's meant to be doing that engagement piece might find themselves sort of in the middle of these challenges. Do you have any reflections to offer about that kind of tension? And if not, Ntokozo could come in, but I'm going to give it to you first, Suchi.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, funding is a big driver of researchers many times, but there's always a reason why that kind of a question has been raised as to why certain research activity has to happen. There are always people, I have found in my personal experience, you'll find always people in the community, you will find always people in the community who are thinking about this. And it's just about spending that time to figure out who these people are, whom you can bring as the first onboarders to drive that research agenda within the community. And that needs a lot of initial work, because you can't just go and your data will not be valid, because if you're just going and implementing a research, bringing them on board, bringing these shifters who might be interested in that theme, who might see those deep thinking thoughts, that might be just one of the things to start with. And having that plan, knowing that this is not an agenda that the community, and we see a lot of that in sexual and gender-based violence researches and reproductive rights researches, where community doesn't want to discuss it, especially, sorry, just a second. Yeah, sorry. Then in those situations, in those places, we have always found, and especially I've seen it, we have a lot of people have reflected on this, that we have always found there are people in the community who will come on board, who will work with you, and there is investment to be done in time and the way push and pull within financials happen. And we've done that recently, and as a feminist movement we haven't been appreciated, but that's the expertise we bring on table as movements. So yeah, over to you, Ntokozo.
Actually, Ntokozo, I'm gonna have to. We're actually like almost at time. If you want to offer like a one sentence or a 1 minute, no, okay, you're okay with that. Well, I mean, I hate to cut you guys off because honestly, this could have gone on for another several hours. The insights you had to share were incredibly rich, and it is great to also hear you talk honestly about the challenges of doing this work in practice, but your commitment to these, really rights-based causes. And your position, sort of feeling strongly your own position, but being critically reflective of it in an ongoing way it was just really great to hear that. Everyone in the chat box now is going to be posted a bunch of links to where you can now find material from today. Thank you everyone who showed up, who listened, and obviously a very big thank you to our fantastic speakers. Your time and your energy is much appreciated. The recording of the session will be made available, as said at the beginning, and that you can also visit the Arch Knowledge Hub or the Mesh page to find a whole bunch of other kinds of materials, resources, reflections, jumping off points into deep dives into other subject matter that you might be interested in. And if you're not already, please sign up as a member of Arch and Mesh to hear about future free events. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Sorry if we missed any questions. Suchi and Ntokozo, have you guys shared your details? Are you open to people reaching out if they wanted to get in touch more specifically about your work? Maybe just confirm that verbally, or
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I don't know, should I just copy and share on the chat?
Yeah, people are still in the chat and we have a minute to go, so it's not going to automatically shut off. So if you're willing for people to reach out to you, then
I've added my email ID. Please feel free to reach out.
Okay.
Will be more than happy.
So everyone who's got more burning questions they would like to ask, or just to get more exposed to the great work they've been doing, please do get in touch. And with that, as we've reached the hour mark, we'll release you all back into the world to whatever time of day you're at, whatever meal you're about to have, whatever real life events are going on with you. Thanks again. It was really lovely for me to meet you, Suchi and Ntokozo, and to be exposed to your work. So thank you, Helen, for the opportunity to do that. And thanks, Global Health Network, Arch and Mesh, for hosting this. And
thank you,
fare thee
Erica.
well.
Thank you, Erica, for a great hosting.
Bye.
Once more onto the brink, as they say. All right, take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.